Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this ALNAP webinar on the State of Humanitarian Innovation. I am Alice Obrecht, and I am the Head of Research and Impact at ALNAP, and I'm the co-author of the recent State of the Humanitarian System report, which we released last year. We have a really excellent lineup for you today, so I don't want to take a lot of time up at the top here, but I just want to provide some brief background and framing on why this event, why the topic of innovation in the humanitarian sector, and why now. So the origins of this event and the report that we've launched on the impact of humanitarian innovation, which you'll be hearing about today, starts back in late 2018, early 2019, when ALNAP was doing the launch events for the previous edition of State of the Humanitarian System. And at a lot of these launch events, the World Humanitarian Summit at the time was only about 2 years old. Innovation was a key theme at that summit. And what we were hearing a lot of at those launch events of our report a couple of years later is, where's innovation going now? What's been the impact of all that innovation work and investment in the sector? What has it really done for humanitarian performance? And we felt that looking at the traditional evidence base that ALNAP uses for our State of the System report, which relies a lot on the synthesis of existing evidence and evaluations, not a lot of evaluations and existing research really looked at that. So we set out to do an original piece of work, which was led by Catherine Kamanji, Hazel Mugo, and Lydia Tanner at the Research People, with Ian Gray from Gray.Catalyst. And you'll be hearing more about the findings from their work in a minute. So we wanted to produce some original research and thinking around the connections between humanitarian innovation and performance. But more than just releasing a report, we also felt when it came time to release this report, we wanted to create an opportunity to stand back and really reflect with the key leaders and thinkers on humanitarian innovation on where the sector's work on innovation is at now in 2023, at this point in time, what it's achieved, and where it needs to go. And the reason why it's good to be coming back to this conversation around innovation is that the sector has really been occupied with a focus on change over the past few years, change processes and how they happen, how they're successful, and when they're not successful, why. Innovation plays a critical role in change because innovators are, at their heart, change makers. They are fundamentally dissatisfied with the status quo, and they think that we can and should seek to do better. So what we'll reflect on today is what we know about innovation and its impacts. We'll be talking about how strategic has really been the investment in innovation. Has it been strategic or not? Where are the gaps? But we'll also reflect on what innovation story tells us about the humanitarian sector as a whole and the changes that need to take place to meet the very challenging funding and operational challenges of the years to come. So I think we'll have a great discussion. We're really delighted to be joined by all of you, but also by our expert panel. I'll start with a bit of housekeeping really quickly. Please use the chat function to comment or to introduce yourself. Please do introduce yourself because we don't have the names automatically popping up on the sidebar. Please use the Q&A function to ask questions and upvote for questions that you like. You can also raise your hand when we go to the Q&A section. And you can come off of mute and ask your question to the panelists personally if you'd like. And you can join in the conversation with the hashtag humanitarian innovation. All right, so we are going to hear, as I mentioned, from a really top-notch expert panel, but we want to start off today's webinar by hearing from you. So we have 2 poll questions. The first one is to ask you, in your perspective and your experience in the sector, how transformative has innovation been for humanitarian performance and practice over the past decade? So is it hugely transformative, somewhat transformative, or not at all? And we're using Mentimeter, so you can go online to menti.com and use the code that you see at the top of the slide there, 3159186. And let us know how transformative you think innovation has been in your experience and practice for humanitarian performance over the past decade. Some not so sure, somewhat transformative. The middle ground, very popular. Yes, I'm seeing a strong surge of support for the somewhat transformative. There's a few who are thinking hugely transformative, which is really interesting. Great. I think we'll call it for the somewhat transformative. A clarion call for many. Somewhat transformative. Put that on a placard. Great. So we'll move on to the next poll. I think we'll close that one. And it would be particularly interesting to hear from the three of you who said you felt it has been hugely transformative, but also everyone else, of course. What do you think has been the biggest impact of innovation on the humanitarian sector? So it's a very broad definition. Innovations, digital innovations, technological innovations, social process innovations. What do you see as having had the biggest impact on how humanitarian action is delivered and done? Great, so quite a few mentions of Kobo Toolbox, challenging business as usual, so providing the challenge function for the sector. It'd be great to hear whoever put allocating resources more effectively. I would love to see the examples of that. That would be great to know. Digital innovation, the change in mindset and piloting. Great. So it gives us a bit of a smattering of where people see some of the biggest impacts. It's interesting that I don't think there's a clear mention of cash, which is often mentioned as being kind of the classic success case of innovation in the sector, but maybe we're now so used to cash, we don't think of it as an innovation or don't recall it as an innovation. Great. So it's good to get a sense of reflection from all of you on both, where you think the level of transformation has been on innovation, but also what that kind of impact has looked like from your eyes. I'm going to hand over now to the first presentation, which is from Lydia Tanner, who's going to be presenting the findings from our study on the impact of innovation on humanitarian performance. Lydia is the founder of the Research People, which is a consultancy that brings together researchers from different disciplines, backgrounds, and places to do humanitarian research and evaluation. She's worked across a number of organizations, including ALNAP, but countless others on innovation and technology. And if you're like me, wanting someone to explain AI to you, ask Lydia, because she has a PhD in AI from Oxford University. But she's not going to talk too much about AI today. That'll be another webinar. Over to you, Lydia, to present the key findings from this really, I think, very interesting and useful report. Over to you.
Great, thank you, Alice. And thanks everyone for sharing your thoughts at the beginning. That was a great start. As Alice mentioned, this was a complementary piece of work that we did to the State of the Humanitarian Sector report. But that report covers a relatively short 3 to 4 year timeline, and we wanted to look back a bit further. So we looked at innovation over a 10-year period between 2011 and 2021. Over that period of time, innovation had grown in profile. Millions of dollars had been invested in thousands of innovations, hundreds of organizations, and tens of funds. And we wanted to know what has been the contribution of these innovations to the performance of the sector. And so we asked 3 questions, which are written on the screen. 1, over the past decade, what key trends and events have shaped the humanitarian innovation? 2, what types of impact do funders aim for and how do they measure impact? And 3, what is the evidence that investments in innovation have led to improvements in humanitarian action? And I'm going to give a really brief presentation of the 4 areas of the report. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on each area, but hopefully that's enough to whet your appetite to want to go and read it. So starting with events and trends. We did a big literature review in order to answer these questions, and we looked at 60 papers on innovation that came from academia, from NGOs and innovation initiatives themselves, and from evaluators. And we found there were 4 kind of major trends or topics that were coming up across the decade. The first was the emergence of a humanitarian innovation ecosystem, and that really started around 2009 with the launch of several studies on innovation, but also a number of initiatives, including the Humanitarian Innovation Fund. And then over the kind of major crises that happened in the years after that, there was a kind of increased focus on what digital innovations and other types of innovations could contribute to those responses. And in particular, in Cyclone Haiyan, we saw a really big increase in the amount of cash being used. During that period, that kind of led to more and more conversations and events and focuses on innovation, kind of culminating with the World Humanitarian Summit, where it was one of the key topics through which a series of commitments and initiatives and organizations were launched. And that led to the second theme, which was really more of an investment in capacities. And we saw that both at a global level, but also in many capital cities and different regions, so Uganda being one, where there was a really investment in an innovation ecosystem. And we saw really the investment in capacities happening in 2 ways. One was in innovation labs that happened within organizations, and we're going to hear a bit more from Nan shortly about an example from the ICRC. And the second was in funds and hubs that would foster cross-sectoral innovation initiatives. And through that period, there was really a tighter focus on sector-specific innovations rather than kind of open calls for cross-sectoral initiatives. The third major trend or topic was around technology to drive organizational improvement, and we really saw that throughout the period. I don't need to kind of restate to you all of the different technologies that have been implemented. You'll have seen those yourselves in your own organizations. But just to say, I think that in the literature, what we saw was that many of those were linked to a drive for more digital approaches to cash, as well as a desire to explore technology partnerships, partly for looking at alternative funding models, and partly looking at how to engage with the private sector in order to bring more technologies to bear. And the final trend that came through, and really from 2015 onwards, was a desire for responsible innovation. That was kind of kicked off with one of the OXHIP conferences back in 2015, where there was a set of draft principles for ethical innovation put forwards. And there's been a series of guidelines and principles drafted since then. And the focus of those, other than responsible innovation generally, has been about how to work with the private sector and concerns around digital risk, and both topics remain very pertinent today. The second topic then is about what has been invested in. What are the areas where we've seen innovations? And the research, again, looking at those 60 papers that I mentioned, really highlighted 4 different areas of investment. The first primarily came from international NGOs and UN agencies investing themselves in their own operations and back-end innovations. The second was about programmatic and enabling innovations, and these really covered all of the humanitarian sectors, as well as some kind of cross-sectoral innovations such as digital data gathering. We then saw a kind of emergence of these humanitarian to humanitarian, H2H innovations, which were startups or new organizations that were formed in order to provide services directly to humanitarian organizations. And then finally, a really rich array of innovations coming from outside or kind of adjacent to the traditional actors, from local and non-traditional actors, and some great examples are provided in the report of a kind of wide array of these different initiatives. And we then wanted to say, okay, so these are all the different things that have received funding and investment. These are the different trends that we've looked at, but what has been the impact, what's been the contribution to performance of all of these different initiatives? And that's really the focus of the State of the Humanitarian Sector report. So we wanted to know how has innovation contributed? Unfortunately, the literature has really little to say about that. There are kind of studies on some specific initiatives, in particular cash and blockchain has had quite a lot of academic study, but in general there was very little literature that allowed us to draw any conclusions about how innovation has contributed to humanitarian performance. And so we formed an advisory group of 8 of the innovation-specific funding mechanisms, and they're listed here, who incredibly generously gave their time and also their data in order for us to do some meta-analysis on 540 different innovation projects that were all funded between 2012 and 2021. We kind of looked at that data to understand what are the different initiatives that have been funded. Many people assume that innovation is really all about technology. And what we saw was actually technology's made around 23% of that portfolio, but there was a wide number of other products, other processes, and other research studies that had contributed to that investment portfolio. Most of the funding was sector specific, and there were the greatest number of innovations for WASH and for health, but actually investments across the whole range of different sectors, clusters. There were relatively few cross-sectoral innovations or policy innovations. The funding was concentrated in some specific geographies, particularly in East Africa. There was lots of investment, but several other hubs as well. And in part, that was because of a focus on testing innovations in relatively easier operational contexts. And the majority of funding was for prototyping or piloting. And you can see that when you look at the distribution of grant funds across that portfolio, with the majority being for relatively smaller pieces of funding for piloting and for prototyping. So what was the contribution of those 540 different initiatives? We looked back at a piece of work that ALNAP did on how to assess contribution. And that really highlighted 3 different ways that innovations can contribute to humanitarian performance. First, through learning, second, through improved solutions, and third, through adoption of those solutions. So starting off with learning, this was really a good news story. All of the initiatives had focused on testing, developing proof of concepts, conducting research that would help to understand problems and solutions. All of them had processes in place to collect learning from their grantees, to aggregate that learning internally, and often that learning was also being publicly made available to the sector. When it came to looking at improved solutions, that was much harder to measure. So as in the broader humanitarian sector, particular challenge for demonstrating effectiveness is the difficulty of comparing humanitarian innovations with a control group in a way that's technically sound and also ethical. And that's really compounded by a lack of baseline data. So what we found was that evaluation data could be collated for about 21% of grants, but given the long timelines over which innovations have an impact, most innovation funders didn't have the funding available to them or the capacities in place to track those innovations over long periods of time. And so it wasn't possible to draw kind of firm conclusions about what the collective contribution of those initiatives had been to humanitarian performance, although we did see a kind of really impressive array of proof of concepts and pilots and initiatives being developed across sectors. When it came to the adoption of improved solutions, again, it was difficult to track. We did some deep dives ourselves in order to try and understand which innovations still existed. And we found that innovations had been adopted in other contexts in around 11% of cases, but the innovations were still being used in a further 23% of cases. So in total, 34 of all these initiatives that had been funded still existed. And for the further 66%, it wasn't possible from the data that we had to draw conclusions. But if we look at comparable initiatives across other sectors, that 34% should actually be seen as a significant achievement. So our conclusions. Firstly, investment in innovation is relatively low. The total investments in this study represented around £80 million over 10 years. And given that funding for UN humanitarian appeals reached over 20 billion in 2021, this represents a really small fraction of overall humanitarian funding. Secondly, assessing the impact of innovation is going to require more investment in data on innovation grants themselves, but also better baselines for the sector so that we can look at the contribution of these initiatives to overall performance. Thirdly, despite the many barriers to innovation, lots of the initiatives that were funded still existed and are still active, and that should be seen as an achievement. But while there were pathways to scaling, and those are explored in more detail in the report, overall the system has been really slow to adopt innovations. And there's lots of reasons for that are going to be explored through this webinar, but they include misaligned incentives, insufficient funding, and organizational capabilities. So I just want to end by saying huge thank you to my co-authors, but also to the innovation initiatives who generously gave of their data and their time to support this research.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Lydia. Really interesting. And again, it highlights the challenges around having that kind of dedicated, continuous support for M&E and doing longer term evaluations and coming back to measure success and just the costs of having to do that as well. I think that segues quite nicely into the next presentation. Now, Lydia, again, I think you mentioned this, but I think it's really important to underscore this so that everyone can follow along. The study that we did was based on what you might consider a subset, it is a subset of all innovation, investment, and practice in the sector, right? So it's these multi-funder, multi-donor organizations. There's a number of other approaches to funding innovation. We're going to hear from Nan Bazard in a minute from ICRC. There's a number of major humanitarian agencies that have their own internal innovation functions that pilot, test, and scale innovation. Those were not included in our study. But still, I think it's quite striking that you point out how little that investment has amounted to when you compare it to the overall cost and amount of funding going to humanitarian action overall. And that picks up quite nicely with a theme that Jess Camburn is excellently placed, probably best placed than anyone to speak to. Jess is the chief executive of ELRA, an organization I think all of us know very, very well. She's also the founder of ELRA. ELRA champions the role of research and innovation in the humanitarian system. It's the host of the Humanitarian Innovation Fund and has invested in hundreds of research and innovation programs globally. Jess is personally passionate about changing the lack of investment in research and innovation in the system and has been committed to working with others to make sure that the challenges faced by people affected by crises get the attention that they need. And I think, Jess, that's a nice introduction to ELRA's global prioritization exercise, because that's what you've been trying to do, right? Is get this big picture on what is the level of investment overall on innovation and research in the sector, and how can that be strengthened? So we're going to turn now to Jess, who's going to present findings from a report that ELRA released last year that's just looking at the funding piece, and that's part of a broader piece of research that will culminate next year, which Jess will briefly talk about. So over to you, Jess, to tell us the bigger picture on the funding for innovation. I think you're on mute. It has to happen to someone, doesn't it?
It's always me, isn't it? Are you seeing my slides? Could I just check, because we had a bit of an issue with the slides. Can you see them on screen, Alice?
No, not yet, unfortunately.
No. Okay, let me see if I can. Oh dear.
I know they were working just a minute ago.
1 second. I think I've.
Oh, I think it's coming up now. Yep,
yeah.
They're there. And just
Okay,
the slides without your notes. Yeah.
Yes, good. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And I've been really enjoying seeing everyone who's been popping up to say hello. It's really lovely to see the expansion of this community from where it was even 5 years ago. So I'm delighted to have such a big audience to talk to. This is a bit of a different presentation for me because I've been asked to just present the data, and I'm going to try and really stop myself from commenting on what that means and giving my own opinion on it. So do interrupt me, Alice, if I overstep that line. But just to start off, the GPE, for those who don't know it, is ELRA's biggest program of research that we've ever undertaken. It aims to shed light, as Alice said, on the humanitarian research and innovation ecosystem, what it looks like, how it operates, and who the actors and funders are within it. And I'm going to refer to this system as the HRI system for speed, if that's okay. Now, the GPE program includes 16 different studies and consultations that investigate different aspects of the HRI system. And this work has included a systematic global mapping of the actors and funders, a series of consultations at different levels within the system, research into the global architecture for HRI, and what we're going to talk about today, our first ever attempt to track and quantify the financing of research and innovation within the humanitarian system. I'll just try and hopefully move our slides on. Okay, did that move on for you? Okay, so the funding flows is what I'm presenting today. Now, this piece of research was led by a team of researchers at the American University of Beirut and has been hugely supported by my colleague Ziad Issa, who was working at ELRA. He's now of ActionAid, but I believe he is with us today. So hi, Ziad, if you're in the room. The piece of work tries to fill one of the biggest gaps in our current knowledge regarding research and innovation in the humanitarian system. And that, as Alice said, is about how much is being invested, who is investing, and where is it going and what for. So that's what we try to answer through this research. Okay. So how do we do it? Well, it was complicated. We began looking at where financial data was captured in the system, and we selected a range of public databases, which I hope most of you will be aware of. And these capture the funding at different levels. So at the global level, we looked at 3 particular databases: the IATI, the International Aid Transparency Initiative, the OECD Credit and Reporting System, and OCHA's Financial Tracking Service. And then we also selected 1 regional and 3 national level databases to explore how well funding allocations were being recorded against humanitarian issues. Now, these data sets have given us some really interesting results, and they are fully written up in our report, but I'm not going to focus on that today. So for today, I'm going to really focus on those 3 at the global level, which track funding from within the humanitarian system, and primarily the data from IATI and FTS. But before we go on, I think it's probably about time that I address that little elephant that's in our slides here. So it's actually a bit of a massive elephant and a bit of a problem with our financial data. So as we got into this research, it became really very quickly apparent that there are many huge gaps and holes in the recorded financial data on humanitarian research and innovation. So for example, these databases not capture research and innovation investments from the private sector, nor are they able to document the independent allocations that agencies invest in their own R&I programs. So you're going to hear from Nan about her program of research and innovation. Most of that would not be captured on these databases because it's independent funding that's being allocated. Also, beyond the quality and accuracy of the records, beyond the data that's captured, the quality and accuracy of the records in the systems is really weak, and it's very hard to go very deep into the results to any level of specificity. That said, there are still some broad trends in the, from the available data that are worth paying attention to, and I'm going to try and cover for you today. But I'm going to leave our little elephant in the corner just in case we forget what he's telling us, which is that these findings can only be seen as illuminating but not concrete. So let's move on to what the data does tell us. Okay, and Lydia mentioned this, that in her findings, generally we're very low in terms of what we invest in the sector. So you will have seen from the previous slide that IATI documented about 0.19% of total HRI funding of total humanitarian spend. That puts us at pretty much the lowest level of sectors that invest into research and innovation. This table, many of you will be familiar with it. It was presented at the WHS by Deloitte, who aggregated that back in 2016, the figure was around 0.4% of total resources going to research and innovation. Our research, which covered the period from 2017 to 2021, suggests that that's actually lower and more close to 0.2. That said, a little bit more encouragingly, move the slides on, we are beginning to see a slow growth in investment in research and innovation year on year. So if you can see back in 2017, the figure was about 0.12. That's more than doubled to 0.26 by 2021. And it's doubled both in percentage, overall percentage share, but also in total value as well. So encouraging, if small growth, if you look in comparison to the overall humanitarian spend. Next, we're going to look at who has provided that funding. So this table, again, shows that the different data sets provide very different answers. It shows that, oh, I forgot to clarify something. I'm so sorry, I rushed through. The funding in the different data sets are assessed. I'm going to go back to that slide, actually, because it's very important. Excuse me. About funding envelopes and HRI specific. So the data sets record different types of information. The IATI data is very specific. It can tell us, using specific RNI codes, the type of the individual projects that receive funding for research and innovation. However, the FTS and other data sets aren't able to do this. They can only give us the data based on a funding envelope. So that means you might see a £2 million project, which is recorded as having an RNI component, but we can't go deeper than that. We can only see that it's a £2 million program. It might have a 10,000 RNI component or a 500,000 RNI component, but we can't tell that from the data. So when you'll see the different data sets, some will be HRI specific, which means we can tell exactly the size of the projects, and some will be funding envelopes, and we try to specify across the two data sets. And that can tell us different degrees of quality of information. I'm going to go back to where I was, excuse me, flying through my slides here. So here, we're looking at the funding envelopes on the left-hand side, which are captured by OCHA FTS. And in this table, we'll see that Germany was by far the largest funder, with EU and US roughly in second and third place. However, as you're going to see in the next slide, much of this funding was given through a very small number of very large institutional grants. So in the next column, you'll see the funders who funded the largest range and number of projects that support research and innovation. And FTS finds Norway and Denmark in the top places in that categorization. On the right-hand side, then, you've got IATI, and these are more the HRI specific figures. So again, remembering that they are around exactly what is funded in terms of research and innovation projects. And this is more interesting, I think, because it shows what we can do in the IATI figures is we can quantify the total value of all HRI funds that have been reported. And then we can look at splitting that down by percentage of who contributed those funds. And you'll see in this that UNICEF contributed 50% of the total HRI specific funding that's been recorded in the database, followed by the FCDO at 35.5%. So these ones are tracking specific innovation and research projects, and we can see kind of quite specific action by those actors there. Moving on then to the next graph. Now this, I really apologize, it's really small and hard to see, but it is interesting. So I wanted to use it to illustrate the point. So at the top of this, if you can see it, you're going to see the primary funders. So these are the actors who provide the funding for research and innovation, looking at the FTS data set this time. So you'll see some kind of recognizable donors in that top level. At the bottom, it shows the recipients of that funding. So you're going to note here that the vast majority of these recipients are the large UN agencies or the international NGOs. And that reflects a trend that's backed up by Lydia's research, and also by our own research. So in our global mapping of the actors and funders, again, it showed this trend. And our other data sets are also showing this trend. So I think although the financial data is uncertain, if there's one takeaway that we can be confident in, it's that the vast majority of funding in HRI still goes from funders based in the Global North to institutions who are similarly headquartered in the Global North. I know this is not surprising, everyone knows this, but it's still disappointing to see it so brazenly written into the figures. Alongside the recipients of aid, we also wanted to look at the locations of where the research and innovation activities were being targeted through the financial data. And so my next slide illustrates this. So you'll see here that the recipient countries is documented by the different data sets for the recipient countries of research and innovation funding. Now remember, of course, these are the countries where the activity happens, but the majority of this funding is not going to actors who are based in these countries. It's going to those large institutions. And two things for me stand out from this data. The first is you'll see that highlighted blue category, that there's an unknown country receiving quite a lot more than its fair share of funding. And again, this shows us that the limitations of the coding in the system. So people are not coding countries, we can't see where that money's going or what it's focusing on. Now, it's really interesting that even though the IATI specific funding codes give us more accurate data in capturing the individual RNI projects, they're still somewhat dropping the ball when it comes to documenting where that funding is being spent. And there's a big gap in the IATI of over 50% of its funding not documenting the location that it's being spent within. The other thing that stands out in this set is that some of the countries are absent that we might expect to be here. So in the period from 2017 to 2021, there was some pretty large humanitarian crises happening in countries that do not appear in this table. Note, for example, the absence of Syria and of the DRC in this table across all the data sets. So my final graph I wanted to share with you, if I have time, Alice, is what sectors that the finance was spent on.
Yes, here very briefly. Great.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so we've looked at this by the UN clusters, which are recorded in the data sets. And again, you'll see that there's some sort of strong sectors that are getting quite a lot of funding. So in the IATI, HRA specific funding, we're seeing protection, education and health being by far the front runners of HRI funding. Whereas sectors like emergent telecommunication, interestingly, shelter, non-food items, early recovery and camp coordination and camp management are receiving much less funding. Annoyingly for me, it's not possible to get conclusive data on the intersectoral funding as the databases do not code and allow for this. So that's a big missing piece of our information. So finally, if I have time to quickly wrap up, I'll just conclude what I think we can take away from this data. That is, as Lydia also mentioned, if we're confident, or even if we're broadly in the right area of 0.2% of total humanitarian resources, we can see that global spending on HRI is extremely low compared to other sectors, but also compared to the continued call for adaptation and change and urgent new solutions for humanitarian practice. We're not going to get there with 0.2% of total HRI funding. Secondly, we can see that funding for HRI in the sector comes from a pretty small group of northern donors, and mostly goes to international actors headquartered in the global north. And we can make of that what you will. Similarly, the recipient locations of the investments do not always match the locations of greatest humanitarian need. And finally, that we can see that some sectors receive disproportionately more funding than others. But if there's one final takeaway I want you to all take from this presentation, that the quality of the financial tracking in our system is terrible. There are huge weaknesses in the databases and in the codes that we use. So it's really, really difficult to follow the money. And that means if we cannot get a concrete picture of what's been spent where, on what issues, by who, then we're just not going to get to that ambition of having a coherent, coordinated and effective HRI system. So if there's one call to action, it's please to all demand that we record better and we have better codes in our financial tracking systems. I will leave it there, Alice, but just to say, all our research is being published through our website, and if you want to catch up on that, please join up through our mailing list and we'll keep you updated. You can find the full report on our website as well. Thanks, Alice.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Jess. A lot of food for thought. I'm going to flag a question that we'll come back to both Lydia and Jess on, that's come up in the Q&A, and please do keep sending in your questions and voting up the questions that you want to see. So both for Jess and Lydia, a question from Layla on how innovation was defined in your research, and how did you look at, or did you look at innovation in humanitarian financing, such as blended finance? So I'll come back to you in a minute for that clarification and some other questions. But for now, I want to move on to our panel. Very distinguished panel. So our panel of respondents to these two presentations are Nan Bazard, Takeshi Komino, and Nick Leader. So Nan Bazard is the head of innovation at the ICRC. She has an illustrious humanitarian career, the most important of which was that she served for 5 years as the chair of ALNAP steering committee. Never mind, executive director of ICVA and international director of the American Red Cross. And she sits on the chair, or is the chair of the boards of many, many innovation initiatives and funds across the sector. We're really delighted to have Nan with us today. I'm going to go to you first, Nan, on the experience from ICRC, because we've heard basically from Lydia and from Jess that the data is really bad, sadly. So it's really hard to get this kind of global quantitative picture. It'd be interesting to hear, for lack of a better word, more of the anecdotal experience, I suppose, that people who are in positions like you can speak to from ICRC's experience of innovation. So where have you seen at ICRC the impact that innovation has on ICRC's performance? What's one of the big barriers or challenges that you think is most important to address? Is data also an issue for you, or where do you see the other challenges and barriers? So over to you, Nan, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Alice. It's great to see you and great to be back with ALNAP. I guess first I would say that I very much agree with the conclusions that Lydia offered from the 10-year review. And if anyone has a chance to look at the report, even if you just go to the conclusions, it's really rich, and I think they're really spot on. And just to respond to Jess, I think that kind of follow the money has been a thorn in the side of humanitarian work for a long time. I would add, in addition to the struggles that you see, we have some underlying other issues around funding, innovation, and research, which is its own complexity, which is this definition of innovation, which I think we all struggle with. And I'll be curious to see if you and Lydia, Jess, you and Lydia have the same response, but that's certainly been an issue in the ICRC. 2, why do you do innovation? What's its purpose? Because without its clarity of purpose, it's very hard to then think about your impact. And then 3rd, do you have the capabilities to do so if you think it's correct? So that's kind of my kind of initial response to what I've heard. From an ICRC perspective, I think it's very important for people to have just a brief background. We're in a very privileged position to have a private donor who is invested in innovation capacity at the ICRC. This private donor is also very innovative in their own world and sees the value of it, and I think expects us to be able to be fit for the future as an important institution. So it's a very luxurious position to be in that we take quite seriously. In terms of impact, so we have over the last 5 years invested in about 120 initiatives. I would say that we are only now, 5 years later, being able to begin to see the impact. And this is partly because the ability to follow things takes a long time. And that's not something that most of the humanitarian agencies are structured for. There's huge staff turnover, things get forgotten. But we have some proxy indicators of the 120 initiatives, which I think begin to get at impact. So one proxy indicator are do initiatives that have proof of concept get put into the next year's budget and plan. And 50% of ours do. Now, just as an aside, when I very proudly expressed that to my governance board, they said, "Oh, you should be failing more." So I do think, we struggle with what do we think innovation's for. The second thing is that about 30% of what we've invested in become building blocks for bigger transformations in the institution. So again, it goes back to why are you doing innovation? Because you can't know what your impact is if you don't know why you're doing it, and you can't create an enabling environment if you don't know why you're doing it. I'll talk a little bit faster. I think that the impact that we've had has been one on some of the initiatives that I do think are starting to make a difference, usually very sector specific. So that mirrors some of the work that Lydia found. But also, I think that we have been able to start to introduce more rigorous thinking around problem identification and solutions. There's no lack of creativity and there's no lack of innovative spirit within the humanitarian world, and certainly not any limitations within ICRC. What we have is a lack of carry through, follow through, which is going to get to Ian's point about scale later. That is an issue. I could go on, but in addition to our technical support that I think is very important for impact, we also provide political support, which in an organization like the ICRC is also quite meaningful. I would also say that our impact is increasing and will increase enormously more if we can really structure our strategic foresight capacity. This is something that we see could be, if we do it well, really methodological strategic foresight, not just, oh, where we're going to be in 50 years, but really back casting it into our institution. We can not only make better planning, but make better innovation investments. And we have, I think that is something that's quite important to us. And I'm happy to say more about how we think strategic foresight is so important. One of the biggest things that is a barrier, and no surprise, is knowledge management. And knowledge management inside our own institution. We were just talking to someone who was talking about how when he was in an emergency response and they couldn't get through for access because of all the muds, he said, well, let's take the tractor. And of course, the tractor did work, and they were able to actually deliver some NFIs, et cetera. Can we have a chatbot, an internal chatbot, which manages our knowledge management faster? Can we start using technology to not only help our own work, but potentially make that more available to others? So I think that, yes, I can say risk management is a huge barrier for an old conservative organization. Yes, having the capacity to stay with things longer term, the money, but also the intellectual and psychological support. But I would also say that we really are struggling with our knowledge management. I think that's one of the biggest things in our institution, but writ large. So thank you again.
Thank you, Nan. Yeah, a lot of points that I think will resonate with a lot of people online. Thank you very much. And I took away 5 years, so maybe that's the new minimum for all innovation funding to make sure we can see impact. Thanks. A lot of things to come back to you on, but I want to turn now to Takeshi Kumino, who is the General Secretary of Community World Service Japan. He's also the Vice President for ADRN, which many of you will be familiar with, the Asian Disaster Reduction and Response Network. And he heads ADRN's Tokyo Innovation Hub. So very, very busy. And we're really delighted to have him here with us today at a fairly unsociable hour in Japan. So thank you, Takeshi. I wanted to ask you, Takeshi, in ADRN's work on innovation, you look at the work of multiple members because you're a network across several countries. Where do you see impact on performance from innovation of those members? Maybe you could speak to what Nan was just talking about of how do you connect the dots? I'm sure many people have ideas for solutions that other members might also find useful. So if you can speak to that at all, that would be great. And what do you see as the biggest gaps or barriers? Does knowledge management ring true for you as well? Over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Alison. Hello, everyone. I'm Takeshi from ADRN. So at ADRN, we started to focus on innovation about 7 years ago, and we also established our thematic hub on innovation that we host in Tokyo at CWS Japan. Nan talked about why we do this, and the reason why we started to do this was, it was evident that the risks surrounding us was really surpassing our capacity to cope, and we are losing a lot more than what we can offer. And the resources at hand to respond to this situation is not growing. So we had to find a way to really transform these impact that we can bring to mitigate the impact from the risks that surrounding us. So after establishing our innovation hub, we started these innovation ventures. And at ADRN, what we focus on is we take the ecosystem approach to innovation. So meaning, we intentionally invest and create linkages of affected communities, innovators, these solution thinkers, problem holders, science holders, enablers. So we believe that these people need to be connected and they need to work together. Because at the end of the day, we believe that these local systems that will continue to generate solutions to their problems. It's not a one-off, but it needs to be constant. pursuit of solution to the problems. And in our recent pursuit also, we're also seeing how locally led solutions are addressing risk factors on the ground and how they generate impact. So, for example, these impact would mean less people will be impacted by the recurrent flooding, typhoons, or volcanic eruptions, drought, and more people can exercise their agencies for building resilience. And what's unique also about these locally led solutions is that they often integrate their local, traditional, and indigenous knowledge into their solutions. And that really links to the cultural buy-ins from the population that they're working with. And because it's locally led, I think the confidence level of the community of being able to generate solutions to their own problems is also increasing. And some of the initiatives are also starting to be embedded in the local government's financing cycle. So we think it's great from sustainability perspective as well. And what we're learning also is that by localizing, it also contributes to the sustainability. The community can constantly try to scope out to what are the unsolved issues that they have in disaster risk reduction, climate adaptation, and also the humanitarian needs when disasters strike. And after all, what we aim at ADRN, what we foresee for the future is that we want to see a resilience movement. It shouldn't be a one-off project, but it needs to be a movement. And if we're going to speak about a gap, there are a few things. So I think with the current pursuit in this innovation field, we are creating a model of this ecosystem-based innovation process to be generated. But in order for these to scale, it needs to become that movement. And this requires having the common value, the shared vision, investment into that process, not a product, but a process, and true localization in this innovation space. And as ADRN, as a network, we feel that we need to play that platformer function in this journey, and to make sure that we continue to invest into this process. So there's a gap, but also aspiration for us.
Great. Thank you so much, Takeshi. Really interesting. I want to come back to you, but I'll save it in a minute on scale and understanding a bit more about these ecosystems that you're trying to create for innovation at the country level. What does scale really mean when you think about scaling something like that? Because isn't it very context specific and super hyper contextual? And I guess it's a question to go back to Nanon as well. I remember speaking to Bernhard at WFP many years ago about this. Hopefully he won't mind me. I'm not quoting him directly, but just something that came out of that conversation was in WFP's experience at that time was their reflection that every time they scaled something that had been in their incubator, they had to really work on contextualization so much that it was almost like a new innovation process each time. So a question to both of you when we come back to this scale issue around how you're thinking about scale and the challenge of contextualization and the need to keep things so locally embedded, as you've talked about, Takeshi, and the importance of that. I'm going to move on finally to the last main panelist, which is Nick Leader. And Nick is currently the team leader for the Humanitarian Research and Innovation team in the Research and Evidence Division at FCDO. Nick has an excellent bird's eye view on humanitarian innovation because he serves as a peer reviewer or an advisor or a funder to many of these initiatives. So Nick, the big question we wanted to ask you, now having heard these two reports, and I know you've been very intimately involved with the ELRA report, we're getting this message that the data is not there. Are donors satisfied with that? We also hear that donors drive the evidence and the M&E agenda in the humanitarian sector. what would donors be thinking about and doing to perhaps lead us to this situation where we don't have enough good data, and what could they do to support better data on innovation? And I guess to add to that, this point that hasn't come up yet, but I know you've talked and thought a lot about, is around what are the expectations we're placing on innovation, particularly for systemic change. Do you think that's realistic? So two big questions for you, but over to you to reflect on those.
Thanks, Alice, and thanks to the other panel members. On the first part of the question that you answered about the data, I mean, I think the short answer is no, not yet. I think as with all public money, there is intense competition for public money, and in order to demonstrate the value, in order to get our hands on that money, as it were, we need to be able to demonstrate the impact. And as yet, we're not doing, I think, a good enough job in terms of demonstrating the impact. I think we are improving, and Elra and others are doing a lot of great work in terms of how we do this. And thanks to all the innovators who are working with Elra, as it were, to improve the data that they are collecting, because I know it's pain, as it were, but we do need it, as it were, to get hold of the money. And I suspect that the shockingly low figure that we are spending on innovation across the system, and I think it is shockingly low, is to do with the fact that we haven't yet been able to demonstrate effectively the impact that we're having. So I think we have a collective interest in doing that better, as it were, to try and up that percentage across the system. But I think although we don't have enough data, we do have. I mean, we know we have data from the development world. We know from, as it were, the health system in the UK, from other big public health, other big public systems. We know that innovation is a normal, everyday, responsible part of that system. We know that we need to keep innovating in these systems in order to improve them. We know that we need to incorporate new technology. I mean, AI, for example, is our next challenge. And if we look back at the way that biometrics were incorporated into the humanitarian system, that wasn't great. We need to get better at incorporating new technology into the system. And so I think we can see the value, and we can see the importance of a intentional and deliberate focus on innovation in the system, but we do need to get better at the data and understanding the impact. Partly to as it were, to keep the taps flowing, but also so we can learn and understand more about how the innovation works within the system. So coming in onto the second part of your question, then, about around what our expectations are and what we can expect from the way that we do expectations, I think we are currently underselling innovation. I think the way that we are doing innovation now in the system is we are good at incrementally improving a whole range of often more technical or sort of niche applications, as it were, and which is good, and that's a useful and necessary thing for us to be doing across the system. But I think what we are not able to do with innovation at the moment is tackle the big challenges, and I think for that we need to collectively get much better at doing innovation and for addressing the barriers that Lydia and others have talked about. I think and as donors, we are, we're part of those barriers, as it were. A lot of the barriers to innovation come from the wider political economy and the way that the system is funded and governed, as it were. A lot of the barriers are baked into the nature of the wider system. And I think, for example, specifically on the funding, we as donors are not joined up enough. I think too often funding for innovation and research is part of wider program funding. So therefore, it often gets sacrificed when things get tight, where I think we need to be thinking about, for example, as we do in many other sectors, having ring fences around research and innovation in order to protect that financing, because it's too vulnerable to cuts in the short term. And we know that innovation and research is a long-term endeavor. And I think possibly most importantly, we need to get better at kind of intentional collaborative reform of systems. And I think that's where we need to be doing better learning, better on challenges like localization, like AAP, a way of collaboratively and intentionally experimenting and then learning from those experiments. If we, as it were, introduce the innovation that we're doing well on the widgets, crudely, towards the systems, towards the system challenges, then I think we'll be in a much more interesting position. So I think if we were better at innovating collectively, we would be able to see some more transformative approaches. But at the moment, we are at the widget end of the spectrum, which is good. I'm nothing wrong with widgets, but it's not as good as we could be.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Nick. And I might come back to you later to expand a bit more on why we tend to focus on the widgets and not these bigger challenges, but really well put. I'm going to go back to Jess and Lydia now. There's quite a few questions coming in, but just to organize some of these for you, I think there's a set of questions here that are basically around definitions, very important. We probably should have defined things up front on a webinar on innovation. So how did you define innovation? And then Aloysia from IRC has a really good question here. I won't read out the whole piece, but the bottom line is, what do we miss when we're studying self-identified innovation versus other things that might be innovation, but we don't call it that or label it? And when does innovation cease to be innovative and become status quo practice, which might be the case for cash? And then I want to also pick up on this question that comes up with Nick's comments, but also in one of these questions, which I now can't see, but it was about the incentives. And if you can go into a bit more detail on the incentives that aren't aligned to support better innovation impacts. So from both of your perspectives, just as a starting point, I'll go to you first, Lydia, and then to Jess. And also any general reactions to what you've heard from the panel.
Yeah, thank you. So it's a great question in terms of definitions. We built our work on the more than just luck research that ALNAP had previously done. And so we used a really broad definition of innovation as an iterative process that identifies, adjusts, and diffuses ideas from proved humanitarian action. And so we included all of the literature that we looked at within that kind of broad definition. When we came to looking at the data, we focused just on these 8 initiatives that would describe themselves as humanitarian innovation funders. So that was a kind of clearer definition. I think the other thing I wanted to say, really pick up on, was there's some interesting discussion points around the solutions we need. And I think this links in some ways to the question about definitions of innovation. For me, it's a really good innovation processes are about having really clear identification of problems, identification of the challenges that we need to address. And once we've defined those challenges, we can more easily look at what are the investments we're making to address those challenges, and what investment do we need to make to invest those challenges. And I think both Nan talked about strategic foresights as one mechanism for doing that, but also Takeshi in terms of investing in locally led identification of problems, and problems from the perspective of frontline humanitarian workers and affected populations. So yeah, I see those issues as really closely linked. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And Jess?
Yeah, thanks, Alice. I was having a little chuckle. It's that old chestnut that comes up at the start of every innovation conversation. How do we define innovation? And in this case, actually, I've got quite an easy answer, because for this research, it was based on the innovation tags that are within the financial data sets. So people self-identify. If they consider their work to be innovation, they would tag it or record it as such, rather than using our definition. However, for our wider GPE research, we use a definition that's fairly similar to Lydia's one. I'm not going to read it out because it's fairly lengthy, but for innovation research, I'm going to put it in the text box so you can, in the chat box, so anybody who wants to read it can read it. There, hang on, let me just see if that's gone in. So those are our 2 definitions of innovation and research that we use across the GPE program. But for the financial tracking, it is self-reporting, self-identifying. Now, I'm not sure how quite saying it. Alicia and also Nina were asking questions, Alice, about what was captured and what was outside. And I think that's one of the biggest limitations. So yes, these data sets and databases capture ODA funding, And if you're not in receipt of that and you're innovating without that, then it's not going to be captured in these systems. And it's a huge gap in the data that we have. And that affects a whole range of actors. Those that innovate just through practice, who might not be recording in a project-based way, but are still transforming practice. And a lot of the more sort of national, local level NGOs who may not be in receipt of the type of funding that would be recorded in the AFTI and FDS, that innovative practice will not be captured either. So it is limited, but even if it's limited, I still think it's important that where we do have that funding, we should make it work a bit harder and tell us a bit more. I think Alicia also asked about when does an innovation stop being recognized as innovation in relation to cash was the question. And I think, that's the holy grail that we're all aiming for, is that once something has been sort of normalized into that standard practice and is not seeking innovative funding, but actually is just getting straightforward operational funding, and is not being, even though it might be talked about as an innovation that has been developed and scaled, it no longer requires innovative capacity to continue and sustain it, then it stops being an innovation. It becomes part of the way that we respond. And I think we're looking, that's a sustainable future we want for all the innovations we're supporting, whether that has a smaller scale pathway than cash. Not everything's going to go to the scale of cash, but I think once it's normalized into practice and financed in a sustainable way that, financing is not sustainable in the humanitarian system, but it's financed in a normal way rather than through innovative support, then I think it stops being tagged as an innovation in the kind of work that we're doing here. Was there another question, Alice, in that set that you wanted to? Otherwise, I can respond to some of the comments of the panelists.
I think so. Maybe you can respond to a couple of them in writing. There's definitely one from Nina. I think that one's been answered by Lydia. So yeah, I think that covers most of the questions around the definitions. There was just one on whether you're missing out on innovations that are internal to donors or that occur in conjunction with ongoing programming that might get missed out. Again, it's about the label, right? Where we're not applying the label of innovation.
In this particular piece of research, yes, we are. If it's not recorded in the data sets, we're not going to pick it up. But in the wider GPE research, we're hopefully picking up on some of those trends and for the consultations and further data sets that we're looking at for the global mapping, for example. But yes, in this particular analysis, that if it's not recorded in the data sets, we can't see it. So it's not picked up. And that's a limitation. I did want to say, Alice, in regards to what Takeshi and Nick were talking about in terms of the, I think, shifting away from the project level of innovation, I think we're on the cusp of that. And I think that's probably the most exciting area of innovation for us to begin to work on. And I think there's a danger that we limit that conversation just again to the global innovation actors and the donors. And I think what Takeshi is showing us actually the critical kind of piece of this picture is to reinforce the ecosystems that are working in crisis-affected contexts and making sure that they drive the systemic change, and we support that when we begin to look at these bigger systemic innovative challenges that we want to tackle.
Great, thank you, Jess. And I just say, to add to your comment, your reply to Alosha, I think someone said once, I thought it was great, that the highest success for innovation is to become boring, because that's when it's actually become widely adopted. Lydia has a quick hand up, and then we'll switch gears slightly and hear a bit more on scale, and then come back to our panel for the reflections on scale and contextualization. Lydia.
There's quite a few comments that ask about how we made sure that we kind of included different types of innovation that might be happening beyond what's appearing in this funding data. I didn't really go into the methodology, but we tried to look quite broadly in terms of the types of papers that we looked at, both from academics, but also from different types of organizations working in different ways in different parts of the world, not only the kinds of organizations that are represented today on this very good panel. And so we also did quite a wide range of interviews with individuals involved in more kind of grassroots innovation initiatives, as well as private sector partnerships and those sorts of things, to make sure that we were capturing the full breadth of activities that were happening, not just those that are kind of trackable through the data that we collected.
Great. Thank you, Lydia. Fantastic. So I think what's come up so far, a lot of core themes or shared themes. Two of them that are standing out is around this issue of scale, to kind of really close that gap and see the full impact of innovation. And another one is coming up around the very sobering statistic that Jess alluded to, which is that a lot of innovation investments are still being funded by and to global North organizations. So how do we shift that perspective to more locally led, contextually driven innovation? So I want to start with this piece on scale, and we're lucky to be joined by Ian Gray. So I'm going to ask Ian Gray to come on camera for a few minutes and tell us where we're at on scale. And Ian is the best person to speak to this, I think. If you don't know Ian Gray, then you don't know humanitarian innovation, essentially. He's done everything across the sector. He's the lead author of the innovation guide that Elra produced. And he's co-authored dozens of innovation papers and reports, including some of the landmark studies on scale in the humanitarian sector with Dan McClure. And just to flag that Ian has a book on scaling innovation coming out next year. So hopefully he'll do a little book event launch for that. And he's working with the UN Secretary General's Executive Office on scaling innovation efforts across the UN. So Ian, can you give us a brief history from your wealth of experience and expertise on how have you seen this approach to scale shift over the past 10 years? Where's the practice at currently? And what are some of the remaining challenges?
Thanks, Alice. Hi, everyone. So yeah, it's been a long while. So we've talked a little bit in the study that Lydia presented on, in really saying that innovation kind of came to light in terms of being acknowledged in about 2009. It'd been going on for many years before that, but it was kind of under the water. And then the iceberg started to emerge in about 2009. And I think we're still struggling with that iceberg issue. And we've seen that today, that there's still quite a bit of what could be termed innovation as under the water. And I think between about 2009 and 15, there was lots of exploration of innovation. Very much at that front end. There's lots of documentation, lots of practice around the front end of prototyping, even to piloting that happened. And so there wasn't much on scale at the time. And as you said, myself and Dan McClure looked into this about 2013, 2014, and we were starting to see that all these kind of pilot projects some of them were successful and they had nowhere to go. So we kind of called them a lot of baby bunnies, and where do they go? What happens to them? And so you started to see others talk about it and engage with it across the sector, 2014, 2015. And you started to see people come up with different definitions. So is it scale up? Is it scale out? Is it scale deep? Are we on our journey to scale? So really trying to grapple with what it means. At the same time as we're looking at scale in that way, there was some pushback. And you can see that pushback today in terms of, well, actually, not everything needs to scale. Some things are just contextually appropriate. They work well in the context they're in because they're for a specific need that is in that context. And so even from day one, there's been a bit of pushback on saying that everything needs to be scaled. And that's good to have and good to acknowledge. But what we got was, with the acknowledgement that we do need to see some things scale, a real focus on supply side. So what we had was the start of funds and programs to provide funding and kind of mentoring and training support. So yeah, Elra with their Journey to Scale, UNICEF, UNHCR with their Humanitarian Education Accelerator, and others started to look at scale and really fund those supply side, which was great. So provide funding and support for a lot of these innovations that had piloted well. But again, you then get to the point where we're saying, okay, and how does this scale further? What does that look like? And the issues of demand side start coming up. And we've talked about some of that here, about the misaligned incentives on demand. So you talked about the Humanitarian Innovation Guide. And in that, if you look at the process we developed, it was very much, we talked about adoption within there as being a core process. How do you adopt new innovations, and what do you need to do to contextualize the innovation itself, your organization, but also work with local communities and others on how that applies. in a particular setting. And what we've seen then is an approach to looking at some demand side issues. So whether that's procurement challenges, whether that's incentivizing adoption through funding and support, we're starting to see that from about 2017, 2018, when those first kind of scale programs were starting to come to fruition. We're starting to see that. And that work is still ongoing, still quite embryonic. There's lots of incentives that still need to be addressed. The other thing we've seen, I would say, since the late 20-teens into the past few years, is this talk about systems, ecosystems, etc. And what we have is still quite fuzzy language and concepts around that, I would say. So we've had, for instance, the idea of ecosystems at a country level that have been talked about here within. So who are the actors? What are the systems and processes in place? But we've also had system thinking at the global level. So what does it mean in terms of the structure, conduct, and performance of the whole sector, and so on. But one of the things I would push back on is the denigration of the widget, should we call it. And the widget works well when there's a system that's aligned around the widget. So from the plow to the printing press to vaccines, huge changes from widgets. But those widgets need a system that is designed around them, and it needs what I often call, we call in the book, layering. So standing on the shoulders of giants. Without ODK, we wouldn't have had Kobo Toolkit and so on. So people talking about that in terms of how things have gone. And unless you have alignment of some of those systems and the interconnection of them, then innovations can't scale. And so that kind of systems thinking is really powerful. And so thinking that way about what the value network is and whether actually incentives are aligned or not is key. Last couple of things before I hand back to you. You asked in terms of kind of some of the accomplishments and challenges before as well. So I think some of the accomplishments are that we're not talking about cash, and we've said it on the panel and other places. But one of the things that we put in the report was some things have even gone further under the radar than that. So I talked about Kobo Toolkit. We do a case study on digital data gathering. It is now the norm within the sector to do that. It wasn't 10, 15 years ago. And we plot out that journey. And it worked well because it overlaid current systems and processes. So it was easy to align with the way the system worked. And it accelerated some incentives. The better the data you can get quickly, the more likely you're to get funding, the more likely you're able to assess needs and deliver quickly. So it aligned very well with that. So there's been a number of success stories, and we need to celebrate those. That the funds and support have actually appeared, and they're too low. As Jess pointed out, they're about the same innovation investment levels as for paper pulping. So that's kind of level we're at in terms of that level. We've also seen those trials to assess things from a demand side and really trying to address those, which is great. And some thinking about systems, which is also good. And the fact that we're having this conversation as learning is happening. When Lydia was putting together the report with the team, we looked at learning, and she said it's 100% across the cases. What? And then she said, yeah, but in terms of the efforts of those funders that we were looking at, they all did invest in learning and trying to get learning and were part of this cohort because they were trying to learn. So that's great. And we're seeing, even this year, for instance, within the UN, the setup of a community of practice around scale. So we're seeing those things emerge, both within agencies with experience and across. And we know what some of the keys to success are. Going back to the report that you authored as well, looking at kind of gatekeepers and some of the things that we had, Alice, in terms of that kind of the review that you did of ELRA projects a while back. In terms of challenges, money's too small, but it's also not structured in the right way. So again, in 2015, we did a study of financing within the sector, and not enough has changed. So in the private sector, you'll have probably 5, 6, 7 tranches of funding, which means the risk level only needs to be incrementally brought down between each stage to get the investment. Where here, it's often 2, maybe 3 stages of funding before you're into mainstream, as it were. Time, you talk 5 years, I say 10. Most innovations take 10 plus years. Cash has been 20, 30 years in its gestation. Digital data gathering, 10, 15 years. Those of us who are old enough remember the PDAs being used in the tsunami response for kind of doing the evaluations and doing some of the assessment. So that is kind of almost 2 decades now, and it's evolving. So we need longer time horizons, and 10 years when it comes to scale is a good one. Methods, there's still too much Silicon Valley transplantation into this sector. We're dealing often with public goods. You don't have venture capitalists circling around public goods. You don't have break things quickly as a good mantra if we're trying to be ethical. So really thinking about what is appropriate in terms of methods and approaches. Evidence, Nick's spoken into that. We need the investment in building the evidence, but I think Lydia as well has spoken into the fact that it's not a level playing field. The way we've done things so far in lots of sectors has a very weak evidence base. Yet the new things we bring in, having to reach a higher standard in terms of evidence base often from what we're trying to replace. So that's an issue that we need to address. Misaligned incentives, we've talked about it. I could talk all day about it. I'm happy to do so. And then this balancing of scaling to localization. And the acknowledgement that if we're going to invest in local innovation, if I'm a local innovator, I don't necessarily want to be scaling my innovation across the world. I want to help my community. I want to create jobs potentially in my community. I'm not bothered about scaling this potentially. So where's the onus on that? Sometimes I will be, sometimes I won't. So to think that through in a better way and balance that kind of scale versus localization. They're not mutually exclusive, but there needs to be a lot of thought around it. And we work on that when we work with innovation teams, just thinking about in your innovation, what's core, same everywhere, what's modular, you give some choice on the changes, and what's hackable. You let people in a new context, new organization completely change those aspects of it. And unfortunately, finally, we're still in the thrall of some fads. So people see a new piece of tech, a new widget, flavor of the month is AI at the moment, and then think, okay, we'll have some kind of hackathon or some kind of event around it without really thinking about how could this transform the sector, and really thinking actually how technologies and processes can be linked together, what we call stitched together, to be really powerful. So just the last example of that, how can you use Internet of Things with blockchain smart contracting to actually flip grants for one-off grants into actually serve as contracts that look at performance and are based on performance rather than just need. So there's a whole bunch of things there. Hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you very much, Ian. Great primer on scale and where we're at in the sector. I'm going to turn now to Nan and Takeshi and Nick to ask you to respond to this issue around scale and what Ian's just been talking about. What resonates for you in your experience? What have you been learning and seeing around how scale successfully happens? And if I may, I want to pose a second question to you, which is the question from Hannah Reichart in the Q&A, who says, in reference to Nick's point about our focus on the widgets and not the more complex shared challenges like AAP localization, is there a risk that we're incorrectly relying too much on the same methodologies for both? And we've underinvested in building out the tools, competencies, and funding for these different kinds of challenges. I am assuming she speaks there to the AAP localization challenges. Have we adequately learned in the sector that one size of innovation, treatment, and funding doesn't work for all problems? So over to you, Nan, first on that pair of questions.
Thanks. Thank you, Ian. That was really a great tour de force of potted history, my new language. And Hannah, thanks. It's a great question, and I think a really accurate one. Just to say very, very quickly, I agree with Bernard, WFP, even though he said this many years ago, I think he would continue to say it, which is that the effort to contextualize a lot of types of innovations takes away from the potential efficiencies, particularly financial efficiencies that I think most donors are interested in with scaling, understandably so, but it's a very particular orientation towards scaling. there is, I think, a very interesting initiative that's happening right now with a group of NGOs on supply chain and logistics. I just heard about it recently, but have come together to, and it's interesting, they've come together to it's like 10 NGOs. I loved this because NGOs, no one gets along with anyone. So this was just innovative in and of itself, but they were really coming together to kind of do purchasing together, to supply chain manage. And this is very exciting, but it's interesting that it's in something that's kind of so practical, so kind of straight and narrow. It's not on mental health. No, we had this in the Sphere project. Indicators on water were very different than indicators on mental health. So I think the kinds of scaled innovations are going to be not on those systematic things that are so nuanced, have so many elements to them, so many variables. So I think that is something. I guess I would just finish with two things. Hannah, I think you're right. It does take a different capability and a different orientation, kind of, again, innovating for what. I also think that technology will create huge possibilities for scaling and connection. I do believe that. It may take 5-10 years, but I think the advancements are going to be phenomenal, and will only become more so. So I would say that scaling is going to also require new capabilities in agencies that we might not have now. Tech capabilities, AI capabilities. And I think we should not be blind to what those kinds of capabilities and partnerships will require of us.
Great, thank you, Nan. Nick, your thoughts on these challenges around scale and Hannah's question?
Right, yes, thank you. Well, first of all, I should clarify that we are pro-widget. And we spend a lot of money on widgets, and we are very pro-widget on the whole. This is my point. Is just that I think most of the most difficult challenges that we face are not, as it were, widget level challenges. They're political and financial challenges, and I think there is a lot to be gained from. This goes to Hannah's question. I think yes. I think I agree with you. I think the sort of innovation architecture and ecosystem we are building is largely built around widgets, whereas I think we could be expanding it to look more at reform. We have we put some problems in the innovation bucket, and we put other problems in the reform bucket. I think we should be trying to bring those two buckets closer together, if that's a thing, and applying, as I said, a much more intentional, innovative way to tackling the challenges that we are currently putting into the reform bucket. I think we would get further if we were able to intentionally collaborate and experiment with some of those things and learn from them, as opposed to now where we have a more kind of individual agency advocacy based approach to these challenges, as opposed to a collaborative experimental approach. That's, I think, is my point. But I think so. I think Hannah is correct in that we need to be looking at the way in which we need to tackle these system reform challenges in a different way. And I think we as donors have a role in that, to try and find a way to finance that, because at the moment I think we don't really have the instruments to finance reform experimentation or system experimentation, if you like. And that's what I think I'd be really interested in trying to evolve. But I think there are other potential institutional, I think, just again, also on the widget level, it's still not working as well as it should. And there are a number of innovations out there which should have scaled more than they are, for which there is good evidence, and which are demonstrably better than the things that a lot of people are currently using, and they are not scaling. And that's a problem. And I think we need to look at the institutional barriers to that. One example that I think is worth looking at is what we have in the UK, the National Institute for Health Excellence, NICE. I think there are similar institutions in a lot of other countries that sort of say this innovation, this way of working is better than that way of working, and you should, as a responsible provider, be if you're in the business of providing healthcare or water, whatever, this is what you should be using, and this is the evidence to demonstrate that. I think that's the type of institution that we could possibly look at to try and move these things along. But I think we need to be, and there are other ways of doing it as well, but I think we need to be looking at ways to push innovations where we have the demonstration that are demonstrably better than what other people are using now. Finance is part of that, but I don't think it's going to solve the whole of the problem.
Great, thanks, Nick. And I think it's really interesting what you were saying about there's basically two different models for change. You know, the models for change that are kind of focused on as these classic system reform initiatives, and then the models of change that are brought out by innovation methods and trying to bridge those and bring those two together. Really interesting. Takeshi, your reflections on scale, particularly given this issue around contextualization.
Thanks. So I want to touch on that discussion around scaling versus localization. What we also see is that the innovators may be a great problem solvers, but they're not necessarily the scaler themselves, or being the sales rep of their solutions. I think different people have different roles. However, we also see that the different communities in the region are experiencing similar risks and similar problems. So if we can connect innovators across the region on the common themes, then I think there will be some synergy that will spark between them. They can talk about the science behind that solution, solving the unsolved. And that will, if conveyed right, and if the right group is formed like that, I think it generates a local demand in other place that takes a similar approach to solve the unsolved. And if we can also figure out how to support such adoption process, that could be one vehicle of scaling. And as a network, I think we currently don't have that. I think in order for networks like ADRN to be relevant, I think we need to have those functions. Being a platformer where people with similar risks or similar interests, themes that they're working on can gather and co-create solutions, co-learn from each other. I think that sort of intentional mechanism is required.
Great, and it'd be good to hear you say more, perhaps in the follow-up on how you address those incentives. The incentives for competition, for example, that come up a lot that kind of inhibit this sort of networked sharing of ideas and solutions. But I'm going to turn now to Vanessa Mwangale, because we're just talking about scale versus localization, but also a couple of people have said it's not necessarily versus. It'd be great to hear from Vanessa, because she's the regional manager for East and Central Africa for the Response Innovation Labs. So Response Innovation Labs are labs that are based in crisis-affected countries around the world that support a lot of grassroots innovation in those countries, local innovators. She's a social innovation expert with 10 years of experience, including as the African Regional Innovation Delegate for the Norwegian Red Cross before she joined the Response Innovation Lab. So Vanessa, you've been looking at this issue now for a decade or more. Can you share your reflections on where the sector has come on this issue of really doing as what one of these audience participants has said, Sandy, I think has put this really well in her question. Realizing that innovations in humanitarian response seek to address specific challenges. Who gets to determine what the challenges are? And how involved are the communities that we serve in those discussions? So how have you seen this shift towards more locally driven, locally led innovation occur over the past decade? And what are some of the key things that still need to happen to better support that?
Great. Thank you, Alice. And first and foremost, it's really exciting that we're even at a point of review and reflection when it comes to humanitarian innovation. Of course, as we knew, this is a relatively new way of working. So the fact that we're asking, what is the impact and what is the value means that we've established a need, and we are curious enough to explore new ways of working to support the people that we serve. So in terms of looking at localization and how humanitarian innovation has evolved over time, I actually want to also point back to some of the notes that were indicated within the report and some key insights on areas of innovation that I really want to call out. First and foremost, in terms of both program and operational innovation, something that I thought was quite interesting and I've seen evolve over time is within the report, operational innovation really looked at the organization, for example, adapting technological resources to improve efficiency. So looking at supply chain, etc. And then more programmatic response was, improvements to program like ICCM at community level. One interesting example that also ties in localization, looking at both operational and programmatic innovation, and where the strength lies in trying to link this to for enhanced localization and also scalability, is on the support of tech-enabled community health volunteers that are carrying out ICCM at community level. So we see that the reason that this has been quite effective, especially within the African region, is it is increasing efficiency both at an operational level within the organization, but it's also creating sound impact and sustainability long term. So also, as we're looking at innovation, we're seeing that this linkage between just enhancing innovation internally to support efficiency also does tie into ensuring that as we're implementing enhancement to programming, these two activities can then be linked. Something else that it also shows there is also, as we talk about, the introduction of technology, which can also be limiting in certain areas that we work with. Technology has the advancement to ensure that there's actually true testing within the communities that we work with. So there's not going to be technology that is going to scale successfully unless you've carried out adequate testing at community level, they've provided feedback, and to something that can be useful for our vulnerable communities to use over time. So that's one thing that I've seen, over a period of time that has really been enhanced by the different interactions of other organizations. Another area of innovation also highlighted within the report that I want to call out is, of course, with working with non-traditional humanitarian actors and local innovators. This is especially true for the Response Innovation Lab. We work with a wide set of partners within various regions, whether this is humanitarian organizations, local innovators, accelerators, incubators, local academia, in support of the implementation of various programming activities in the region. The way that we do this is it's also pretty simplistic, but ensures that the programs that we're running are quite rooted within contextual relevance and supported enhancement of local innovators. So some of the activities, for example, that we do is the mapping of different actors within a particular ecosystem. So instead of traditional actors coming in and working with the same kind of people in the same kind of setting, we're carrying out a mapping of all of the actors within the ecosystem just to ensure that we understand who is there that might be able to support this initiative. It also ensures that there's visibility across the board when we're talking about, learning from each other as we're starting off a new program or making improvements in our programming as well. The second thing that it does is it creates an opening. Within the humanitarian sector, we're very protective of the programming that we run, rightly so to ensure that we do no harm, but allowing this visibility into all of the players within this particular ecosystem also allows space for an area of collaboration to understand, not just in the design, can we share information, but also as we are piloting and scaling, how might we be able to leverage these already existing ecosystem within local communities to really support a better development and implementation and scale and accountability of the programs that we're running. And then finally, really looking at what kind of support is needed for locally led innovations. This has come out clearly throughout the panel, but I'll just pick off on two additions to that. First and foremost, of course, research. We need to be able to build a case for not just humanitarian innovation, but then go a step further and say, make a better case for locally led humanitarian innovation. A good example of that is even the report that we're discussing today did mention as a gap that a lot of the publications and the research are not led by researchers that are located in the areas that we work in. So really being able to move a lot of this funding and research to ensure that we can make a case for all of the great work that is happening and leverage on a lot of the already existing solution and partners that we might be able to engage would really support and ensure that we're able to make better locally led innovations that are sustainable, practical, and can be accountable to the communities that we serve. And then second big one, again, not a big surprise, is funding. So we can't have research, we can't be able to support locally led innovations if majority of the funding, as the report rightly mentioned, is still centralized in one area, and we're not really able to implement certain projects on that. A second thing on funding, which I also thought was quite interesting from the report, is that a lot of the funding, when designated for innovation, is focused on more on the piloting and the scaling, with very little on the problem recognition. And as we've learned, as we engage with different partners from the ecosystem, when you're trying to go through the problem recognition is when you'd actually identify the partners that would be best fit for the implementation of programming. So again, in terms of funding and in terms of where the funding is placed, we need to have an additional conversation on how to make sure that even from the onset on problem recognition, that this is rightly allotted to ensure inclusion of local innovators and local communities to allow better design of the programs and the adaptations that we're doing within the community. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Vanessa. Some concrete suggestions there. Maybe making it potentially a new donor rule. I don't know if people like new donor rules, but for any innovation funding, that the problem identification is sufficiently engaged with people at the local level, or ideally been led by them. Great. I want to get another perspective on this, if I may, very briefly, from Natalie Rami, who's the Deputy Head of Innovation Service at UNHCR. Really delighted that she could join us at last minute today. Natalie, we know HCR has been doing a lot of work supporting refugee-led innovations. How do you ensure that that work isn't just lip service and it offers meaningful opportunities to refugees to innovate and identify their own solutions? And what are your reactions to what you've heard today, and what the sector can do to better support crisis-affected people as their own innovators and creators of solutions to their problems?
Thank you, Alice, and thank you for having me today. Well, I think the issue is that most innovation grant programs are usually take a top-down approach, where the priority, the challenges, and the solution are usually identified and designed by international organizations, and where refugees or other local actors are considered our recipients of aid or beneficiaries. We often use that term, right? And I think this is what needs to change. So to give like a concrete example, at UNHCR, we have recently launched the refugee-led innovation program. And that program has been actually designed since the beginning in collaboration with refugees. They are the one who told us this is what the program should offer. And they are the one who designed the program blueprint that we then launched. So really that program has been designed with the vision that refugees take center stage in the delivery of humanitarian work through innovation, and that we provide them with meaningful and flexible funding to allow them to identify the problem and then design the right solution for that. And so that helps us build the evidence that they can be actually actor of change and not only recipient of aid. In addition to that, what we did is that the refugees who designed the program with us are also sitting on the steering committee of the fund. So they are the one that review the new ideas that are coming in and make a decision on funding as well. So their expertise is also taken into account when it comes to what we fund, what we don't fund when it comes to innovation. And in the first round of the program, for example, we have invested over $700,000 directly into refugee-led innovation. And this year, we've launched a new call, and it's probably going to be doubled in terms of investment directly into refugee innovation. So I think what we need to see is really a fundamental shift in the program architecture. And we need to take more of a grassroots approach, whereby refugees are directly given the resources and support that they need to identify the problem and design the solution, because at the end, they are the best placed to do so. And I think ultimately, this is the way that refugees can be recognized by all stakeholders for their role in humanitarian response and development. And then they can take more control over their lives and are seen by everyone as agents that are capable of determining their own future and contributing to their communities. But I think also maybe on the question of scale, because most of the innovation that we have so far been supporting, at least at UNHCR, from refugees are at pilot and testing stage. And what the program does is really boost these ideas and try to give them life. But I think if we want to take that further, it cannot just be a one agency effort. The entire sector needs to make equitable partnership a reality for local actors by making it more accessible to those local actors, first of all, and put innovation led by local actors as a priority on their agenda, and provide the right framework for collaboration and funding for this to become a reality. Over.
Great. Thank you, Natalie, so much. A question that I want to pose really quickly to both you and Vanessa, I'll go to Vanessa first, is we've been talking about these broader reform issues and maybe innovation needs to become more ambitious and address these bigger topics like localization and AAP. The question I want to pose to both of you is, what does innovation add to this? Because some people might listen to what you're doing and what Takeshi was talking about in these community-driven innovations and say, well, isn't that just AAP? Isn't that just what participatory, humanitarian action should look like? Isn't that just what good humanitarian programming looks like? So what does innovation and having that innovation lens bring to these issues around localization and AAP? Does it help accelerate those issues in a way that they might otherwise not be accelerated? I was wondering your reflections on that. So Vanessa first, and then to Natalie.
Great, thanks for that, and great question. And I think this also pulls back into the conversation we're having on, what are you defining as innovation? And innovation can be something as small as improvements in our approach. So right now, for example, integrated community case management was seen as an innovation, right? Previously, it was seen as an innovation. Right now, it's something that local governments and districts are able to do pretty easily. So in terms of the process, that is more process innovation, which was still helpful in ensuring that communities are still able to receive care as and when they need it. And through that new way of thinking, that was considered innovation previously and supported with the implementation of that. So I'd say in terms of innovation and how that helps to ensure that there's proper implementation, that's one example of how to look at that from a more larger scale to how that was integrated into normal programming, which I think is a normal and organic flow in terms of implementation. And innovation should not stay as an innovation. It should be integrated into programming in finality. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Vanessa. And Natalie, your reflections on what innovation lends itself to, I'm sure colleagues at UNHCR, I know colleagues at UNHCR are talking a lot about localization agendas. How can innovation provide that contribution?
Yeah, I think it will echo a lot of what Vanessa has said, but I won't repeat that. I think also it comes to the definition of the problem and the user-centered approach, right? So when you actually are putting the focus on refugee-led innovation, this is where I think the definition of the problem and the user-centered approach is really targeted. Much maybe more when we are the one that are coming there and saying, this is the problem that we've identified and this is the kind of solution that we need to put in place. Because they are ultimately the one that are better placed to tell us, well, actually, this is the real definition of the problem. So I think this is where it makes a difference on those two aspects. And I think also often what that leads is that when a solution comes out directly from refugees who have been consulting with their own community and test and try things within the community, that buy-in that comes out of it is really particular, and you have more facility then to be able to scale that solution or adopt it within a community. So I think this is also something to highlight. And yes, it's true that a lot of people can say this is just AAP, but AAP in itself is not something systematic. I think it is actually very new in itself for many agencies, and I think we're not doing enough of it. So yeah, I think something also to reflect on, I guess. Thank you. Over.
Great. Thank you so much, Natalie. So I don't know, sorry about anyone else, but it's gone by very quickly. We have just about 11 minutes left. We're going to put up a last poll for everybody, asking you for your one takeaway from the discussion today, which I think has been quite rich. And we will be making all of this available to people online afterwards. So I'm going to ask the audience to respond to this poll on your one key takeaway from the discussion. And as you enter that in, I'm going to turn back to our panel and just do a selection of the panelists. I don't know if we'll have time for everyone. Starting with Jess, if that's all right. Jess, what's your key takeaway from the discussion today on what you'd like to see addressed to improve innovation's wider impact in the sector in the next 5 years?
Sorry, I'm mute again. Oh, it's so hard to have one, isn't it, Alice? I think for me, the biggest takeaway is if we are really going to realize the potential of innovation to tackle these bigger system-wide challenges, we've got to sustain and invest in the learning and kind of convening capacity to do that, so that we can work collectively on these issues. If we continue to use the widget financing model, we're never going to reach that potential. So we need to finance the convening, the collaboration, the learning, and to enable that to happen, and particularly focus on how that is connected to crisis regions where these events are happening, and actually center their leadership and their learning in that process.
Terrific. Thank you, Jess. And that reminds me to mention, before I move on to other speakers for their final takeaways, that this conversation can and should and will continue from this webinar today. It's been great to see a lot of familiar faces and names in the chat. A couple of key points or opportunities for people to be aware of. One is just that the GPE that Jess was talking about will be released in Q1 of 2024. So the big final report on that prioritization exercise. Before that, there's the ADRN Partnership Week, or sorry, the Regional Humanitarian Partnership Week, which is the 11th, 12th, and 13th of December in Bangkok. So if you want to talk about and look at innovation in Bangkok in December, highly recommended. And registration is still open for that. So maybe we can drop the link to that in the chat. And then a bit further out in autumn, I think of next year, 2024, mark your calendars, because ELRA is going to start its innovation forum up again, an in-person event on innovation, and they'll be doing a save the date in early 2024. So I just wanted to make sure we mention all of those before people have to jump off, but also don't jump off, because we want to continue hearing from people's wisdom, and it's great seeing all of these responses. So fantastic. I'm going to move on now to Takeshi and hear your takeaway from today and what you think needs to be the one thing that we look at to improve innovation's impact in the years to come.
Yeah, thanks. I think we will think seriously about the platform function that we talked about and how we can play that role. Alice, you talked about that. How do we deal with the competition then in the scaling process? I may be a bit naive, but I don't think competition happens when there is that shared vision, like colleagueship among the people, and people need to be on the platform with the shared vision in order to feel that. And I think we can create a mechanism to allow that to happen. So yeah, we'll definitely think about how to put in place.
Terrific. Thank you, Takeshi. Ian, what's your takeaway from what you've heard today? And one key thing, I know you mentioned a few already in talking about scale, but what we need to see to see better impact from innovation.
Yeah, so there's lots to take away from today. I think the main thing for me is we talk about innovation in the humanitarian sector. It's lots of things. It's like, if you looked at it like an industry, there's lots of different industries. And so I think looking at some of the more transformational aspects, if we could get a end-to-end group together from affected communities all the way up to donors and everyone in between around one particular issue, like localization, and say, actually, end-to-end, we're going to try and change the system in this particular specific area. And we're going to look at all the rules, processes, systems, incentives, etc., around that to see what can be done in one focus area, whether it's AAP or something like that, I think would be really interesting and useful, because I think we scratch the surface across the whole humanitarian kind of sector, rather than just going really deep in one area and coalescing everyone around trying to make the change in that area and providing the kind of the proof case from that.
Great, thanks, Ian. Nan, what's your one takeaway and thing that needs to be improved for better impact?
Of course, I have two, but I'll talk fast. The first is that I think that we will have wider impact if we engage more collectively on strategic foresight. I really am going to bang that drum, because I think it's one of the links between the widgets, incremental, and the bigger challenges that we face. I think technology is absolutely not to be underestimated here. For all that we say, it's not the only thing. I think it's really going to be quite huge. The second thing I would say is innovation has its place. innovation is not going to solve gross violations of international humanitarian law that we see around the globe. And I think here, let's put it in its rightful place. It needs support, it needs attention, it needs funding, it needs places like this to discuss. And we also need to continue to focus on things that innovation alone is not going to change. And it's going to require other things. And I just don't want us to forget that, because we can get very innovation focused, and it's not the whole picture by any means.
Great. Be humble. It's a good message. Natalie, what was your takeaway from the discussion, and one key thing that you want to, again, underscore in seeing higher impact from these investments in innovation?
Yeah, I think maybe my point would be on monitoring and evaluation. I think it's still very difficult to measure impact, and expectation by funding agency are probably misaligned as well. And as one of the panelists had put it, I think this is probably also one of the reasons why there's not enough maybe funding coming into innovation, because there is this gap. So this is maybe one point. And the second point is, are we leveraging enough the expertise of the private sector when it comes to innovation in the humanitarian sector? I think that there is still a lack of real collaboration between the private sector and humanitarian actors. And I think I would like to see probably more of that if we want to see more advances in innovation within the sector. Thank you.
Yeah,
Over.
key issue. Thank you, Natalie. Yeah, lack of strategic points of entry for the private sector, isn't there? Very important. Let's go to Nick. What's your one takeaway?
Well, I'm also going to do two. I think supply and demand. I think because I think there's no. I think on the supply side, I think we need to be talking more about ring-fenced R&D expenditure, as we do in most other industries. I think without it, there's just too many pressures to spend on the immediate and not on the future. So I think that's not just for donors. I think it's also for the big agencies who've got R&D budgets. I think we need to be thinking about ring-fencing that. I think that will solve some of the longer-term problems, etc. And then on the demand side, I think it's going to become increasingly unacceptable for there to be innovations out there which have good evidence, which are not being accepted, which are not being scaling. And I think we need to find a way of, as we do more work on innovation, the number of those, as it were, will increase. I think we need to be looking at ways to, quote, force innovations through where we have good evidence, because it's going to get increasingly unacceptable for that pile of innovations which have good evidence to be unused.
Great. So really shifting the norms and expectations. Fantastic. Vanessa, your key takeaway.
Yeah, definitely from my end, not to repeat anybody else, is enhanced linkages and learning. There's a lot of work going on with a lot of different organizations, a lot of learning that can happen. So trying to see how we might be able to really enhance this linkage, especially when it comes to learning, which would be easy enough to do if the knowledge is already available. So it would be enhanced linkages and learning. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Vanessa. And I think, Lydia, that leaves you with the last word.
Thanks. So for me, I think the takeaway is about the time taken to see impact, and that the processes that we develop, both for identifying problems and for supporting solutions, need to bear that in mind.
Terrific. It takes patience. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much to everyone who's been online and to our fantastic panel. We really appreciate your time and wisdom and insight, and we look forward to participating in further iterations of this conversation next year in those at the end of this year and next year in those opportunities that we've discussed. So thank you very much, and have a lovely rest of your day.